The sun was shining brightly, casting a peaceful glow over our quiet suburban lawn. But that peace was about to shatter. In an instant, my daughter, innocent and disabled, was yanked off the grass by a stranger, a woman, someone I had never seen before. This wasn't a random act of kindness. No, it was an aggressive, cold-hearted move, and the woman, Karen, was determined to make sure my daughter knew her place. I watched in disbelief as she dragged her across the lawn, no care for her safety, no compassion for her struggle. The sounds of my daughter's cries echoed in the air, and my heart pounded in my chest. My family was under attack. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a fight for justice, a battle against an oppressive force that thought they could intimidate us. As I stood there, frozen with shock, I knew one thing for certain: this moment would change everything. What happened next will shock you. It was a typical Saturday morning in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun shone through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the freshly mowed lawns. Birds chirped, and the faint hum of lawnmowers could be heard in the distance. At home, it was just me, my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily. Lily, who has cerebral palsy, was sitting in her favorite chair, watching cartoons as she always did on weekends. Despite her disability, Lily had a joy for life that was contagious, and in that moment, everything seemed perfect. Our small, peaceful life was exactly how we had always imagined it, until the tension began to rise from the place we least expected it, the Homeowners Association, or HOA. For weeks, we had heard whispers about the HOA. They were supposed to be the people who maintained the beauty and order of a neighborhood, but lately, they had been overstepping their boundaries. They'd become more aggressive in their demands, pushing residents to comply with arbitrary rules that were supposed to improve the neighborhood, but really only served to make things difficult. It wasn't just me noticing the strain. Sarah had started to mention it, too. There's something off about them, she'd say, but we never thought it would escalate. Then came Karen. Karen wasn't just any ordinary HOA member. She was the self-appointed enforcer, the one who seemed to take the most pleasure in pushing the rules to their limits. I remember the first time we met her. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her words sharp and calculated. "I'm just here to make sure everything stays in line," she'd said, almost too eagerly. I didn't think much of it at the time, brushing it off as another overzealous neighbor. But I should have known better. The HOA meetings had started to get more tense, more confrontational. Karen was always at the center of it, her voice loud and cutting, demanding changes and threatening those who didn't comply. Her influence had grown, and she'd begun to make waves in our once tight-knit community. She'd rallied others who shared her vision of a perfect neighborhood, and slowly but surely, she had begun targeting the families she deemed undesirable. It wasn't long before I started hearing rumors that Karen had been eyeing our family, waiting for an opportunity to make a move. Her eyes were always on Lily, the disabled child, and I began to worry that our peaceful existence was being threatened by someone who would stop at nothing to get her way. But it wasn't just Karen. The HOA's grip on the community had tightened. Rules were being enforced with an iron fist, and everything seemed to come with a price. I watched as neighbors who had once been friendly became withdrawn, fearful of the HOA's power. The once welcoming community had become a battleground, and I couldn't help but feel like we were being dragged into something we didn't want to be a part of. It was subtle at first, warnings about the height of our fence, complaints about the color of our door, but the stakes were rising. I didn't realize how much the situation was escalating until the day Karen crossed the line. She wasn't content with simply making life harder for us. She was now trying to break us. In those early days, I hadn't fully understood how dangerous Karen and the HOA could be. But that morning, as I watched Lily's innocent smile turn into confusion and fear, I realized just how much of a threat they had become. And it wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about power. Karen wanted to prove she was in control, and we were standing in her way. What started as a small inconvenience was now spiraling into something much darker, and I had no choice but to stand up for my family. Little did I know that decision would lead us into the heart of the storm. It was the kind of morning that made you forget about the outside world. The sun was shining, but not too harshly. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, making the leaves dance in gentle rhythm. In the yard, my daughter Lily was sitting in her favorite chair, her bright eyes glued to the animated characters on the screen. She laughed softly at the funny parts, her small, soft hands resting on the armrests, oblivious to the world around her. For a moment, everything felt right. The house was peaceful, quiet, and the small suburban street we lived on was tranquil, with the occasional car driving by and children playing in the distance. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, listening to the hum of the coffee maker as I chopped vegetables. The smell of sizzling eggs filled the room, and Sarah, my wife, was setting the table. We exchanged a smile, the kind of smile that told me everything was in its right place. We had worked so hard to create this life, one filled with small joys and simple moments, where Lily could play in the yard without a care in the world. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for now, I could forget about the outside world, the growing unease in the neighborhood, the tension creeping into the air as the HOA's influence continued to spread like an invisible poison. As I placed the food on the table, I caught sight of our neighbor, Mrs. Patel, walking past our house. She didn't wave. She didn't even look up. It wasn't like her. Normally, she would stop for a quick chat, ask how Lily was doing, or make a joke about the weather. But today, her eyes were fixed on the ground as she hurried down the street, her shoulders stiff. I felt a small knot form in my stomach, wondering if something had happened. Had the HOA been talking to her too? The last time we spoke, she had mentioned feeling pressured to comply with some new regulations about the height of fences. The rules were starting to feel suffocating, and now it seemed like the weight was wearing down on everyone. I brushed it off, trying to focus on the moment. I sat down at the table with Sarah and Lily, and we ate our breakfast in a comfortable silence, the usual chatter of the neighborhood around us. A few kids were playing in the distance, their laughter carrying through the open windows. But even as I tried to embrace the normality of the moment, something felt off. The air felt heavier, the kind of heavy that comes before a storm, when the atmosphere shifts just enough to make you question whether everything is as it seems. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the yard. I checked on the garden, making sure the flowers were blooming as they should, and wandered over to the fence, where I noticed a small crack in the wood. It wasn't much, but the HOA had recently sent out an email warning that any property damage, no matter how small, needed to be addressed immediately. I'd heard rumors that Karen had been driving through the neighborhood, taking photos of yards and fences, searching for anything she could report. It was like she had a mission to find faults, to make sure no one was stepping out of line. As I stood there inspecting the crack, I heard a car slow down behind me. I turned, and sure enough, it was Karen's car, her silver sedan creeping by, almost too slowly. She didn't wave or acknowledge me. She just stared ahead, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, her lips tight. I tried to brush off the interaction, but a sense of unease washed over me. It was the way she looked at the property, like she was scrutinizing every inch of it. She didn't stop, but I could feel her gaze lingering, like she was mentally taking notes. This wasn't the first time I'd seen her driving slowly through the neighborhood, but it was the first time I felt the weight of her presence. I returned to the house and continued my day, trying to shake off the feeling that something was about to change. As the afternoon wore on, I started to notice other neighbors acting strangely. Mrs. Patel still hadn't returned home, and I saw Mr. Johnson from 2 doors down standing at the mailbox, his arms crossed, deep in conversation with another HOA member. His face was red, and his body language was tense. There was something in the way they spoke, something hushed, like they were discussing more than just lawn care regulations. I couldn't hear their words, but I could see the agitation in Mr. Johnson's posture. He was never one to get involved in anything controversial. To see him so visibly upset made me wonder just how far the HOA's reach had gone. The atmosphere had shifted from a peaceful neighborhood to one of uncertainty, where every neighbor seemed to be walking on eggshells. I knew things weren't as simple as they appeared, but I wasn't ready to confront it yet. It wasn't until I heard the sound of a door slamming, sharp, angry, that I realized it was only a matter of time before the calm was shattered. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here, and we were right in its path. The days after the strange encounter with Karen on the street felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just the quiet tension in the air, it was the slow buildup of something I couldn't ignore. The more I watched, the more it seemed like Karen was quietly orchestrating a campaign to exert control over every inch of our neighborhood. There were whispered conversations in the yard, exchanges of glances between neighbors who were clearly unsettled by the HOA's growing influence. But it wasn't until that afternoon when the tension finally broke, when Karen took the first step from subtle intimidation to outright confrontation. I had always believed that things could be solved with calm conversation, but as she approached our lawn that day, I felt the stirrings of something darker. I was out in the yard again, trimming the bushes, when I noticed Karen walking toward me, her pace deliberate and brisk, like she had a purpose. My heart sank as I watched her approach, a familiar, unsettling smile on her face. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was doing. No, Karen simply went straight to the point. She began, her tone condescending. The HOA has received complaints about the height of your fence. It's not in line with the guidelines. I paused, the hedge trimmer in my hand freezing mid-snip. It wasn't the first time someone had mentioned the fence, but we had been compliant with all the regulations. I tried to keep my voice steady, reminding her that we had made sure the fence was within acceptable limits. But Karen, with her usual air of superiority, dismissed my response with a wave of her hand. "It doesn't matter what you think," she said, her voice sharp. "The rules are the rules, and if you don't make adjustments, the HOA will have no choice but to take further action." I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. It wasn't just the fence. Karen had been nitpicking for weeks. Complaints about the color of our flowers, the alignment of our driveway, and now this. It was clear that she wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was looking for any excuse to make our lives difficult. I tried to remain calm, to not let my anger show, but I could feel my temper rising as she continued to push. I wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of her demands. Sarah had mentioned how Karen had started focusing on minor issues with other families, too. It seemed like Karen had made it her mission to break the spirit of the neighborhood, to drive everyone into compliance with her vision of what the HOA should be. It didn't take long for the argument to escalate. I tried to reason with her, to explain that this was ridiculous, but Karen wasn't interested in hearing reason. She'd come with a point to prove. "You can't just ignore the rules because you think you're above them," she snapped, her voice rising. "The HOA exists to maintain order, and people like you who think they can bend the rules, well, it's time for you to learn that no one is above the law." My patience was wearing thin, but I held my ground. "This isn't about the rules," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's about you trying to control everything and everyone around here." Karen's eyes flashed with a cold fury, and for a moment, I thought she might say something that would really cross a line, but instead, she took a step back, as though calculating her next move. She glanced at Lily, who was still sitting in her chair near the window, watching the exchange with wide eyes, unaware of the growing tension. It was like she was trying to make a point, like her attention to Lily was somehow part of her strategy. Sarah, who had been inside the house, stepped out onto the porch at that moment. She had heard the raised voices and had come to see what was going on. I could see the look of concern in her eyes as she caught sight of Karen standing on the lawn, her stance still unyielding. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked, trying to defuse the situation. But Karen was relentless. "Your husband here is ignoring the rules," she snapped, turning her attention to Sarah. "He's refusing to make the necessary changes to his property, and if you don't fix it, there will be consequences." I could feel the frustration building inside of me, but it wasn't just the argument anymore. It was the way Karen had inserted herself into our family's life, the way she had started to make our home feel like a battleground. She wasn't just an HOA member. She was a figure of authority in her own right, wielding power like a weapon. And it wasn't just about the fence anymore. This was about control, about who had the right to decide how we lived our lives. I could see the strain in Sarah's face, the way she was trying to keep it together, trying to protect our family from the escalating conflict. She turned to Karen, her voice calm but firm. "We've been following the guidelines," Sarah said, trying to reason with her. "We're not doing anything wrong." Karen wasn't having it. "The guidelines don't matter if you don't follow them to the letter," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "And if you don't start showing respect for the community, you'll see just how far the HOA can go to make sure things are done properly." I knew right then that this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. Karen wasn't going to back down. And worse, I could see the seeds of something far more dangerous being planted. Our peaceful life, the one we had fought so hard to build, was being torn apart by a force we couldn't control. I had always believed that I could protect my family from anything, but in that moment, I realized that this was no longer a fight about offense or a minor rule violation. This was a fight for our dignity, for our right to live without fear of someone else dictating our every move. And I had no choice but to stand my ground. As Karen turned and walked away, her final words echoed in my ears, a warning that would prove to be far more ominous than I could have imagined. "We'll be watching," she said, her voice cold and final, before she disappeared around the corner. I stood there in the middle of the yard, my chest tight with anger, my mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The storm was coming, and I knew that we were in its direct path. The air felt thick with anticipation as I stood in the kitchen, staring out of the window. It was supposed to be just another calm afternoon. Lily was playing in the yard, Sarah was inside sorting through some paperwork, and I was about to take a break. But something felt different today. I had been hearing Karen's voice echo in my head all morning, her words repeating over and over. The HOA, the rules, her threats. There was no escaping the oppressive weight of it all. Then I saw it. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I watched Karen walk toward the yard with purpose. She was holding something in her hand, something official-looking. My heart skipped a beat. The lawn was supposed to be a safe place for my daughter, a spot where she could feel free, where she could laugh, run, and let the sunshine warm her face. But Karen was about to turn that into a battleground. My hands gripped the edge of the counter as I watched her approach Lily, her steps unrelenting. My first instinct was to call out, but before I could even move, I saw her reach down and grab Lily by the wrist. My heart stopped. Lily's eyes widened in confusion, and before I could even process what was happening, Karen was dragging her across the lawn, a look of cold determination on her face. "No, stop," I shouted, rushing toward the door, but it was as if time had slowed. Karen's grip on my daughter's fragile wrist was tight, unyielding, and I could hear the faint sound of Lily's terrified cries in the distance. Each step they took felt like a punch to my gut. I could see my daughter try and pull away, but Karen wasn't letting go. "Let her go, Karen," I yelled, my voice growing hoarse with panic and anger. But Karen didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge me. All that mattered to her was forcing Lily into submission, proving that she held the power. "She's trespassing. This is HOA property, and she's in violation of the rules." Karen sneered, her voice sharp and cruel. Her words were like daggers laced with venom. She was trying to justify her actions, to convince herself that she was in the right. I felt rage boiling inside me. It was one thing to challenge me, to make threats about fences and flowers. But this was crossing the line. This was my daughter, my flesh and blood, being treated like an object to be controlled, dragged away without any regard for her safety. The music in my head was deafening now, a steady, pulsing beat that matched the pounding of my heart as I charged toward them. "Karen, I said let her go." I was almost to them now, my legs moving faster than my brain could process. But Karen only tightened her grip on Lily, ignoring my pleas and shoving my daughter forward. Lily's small feet stumbled over the grass, her legs too weak to keep up. She was too scared to move, her cries growing louder. And then, in that moment, it felt as though the world came crashing down around me. I could see the fear in Lily's eyes, the way she tried to look up at me but couldn't break free from Karen's iron hold. It was as though Karen had no humanity left, no empathy for a child, no understanding of the physical and emotional strain Lily was under. She was just an obstacle, something to be discarded, and Karen seemed intent on making sure Lily knew she didn't belong. That's when everything changed. I don't know what triggered it, but I felt a surge of adrenaline that made my body move without thinking. In one swift motion, I reached them and grabbed Karen's arm, pulling it away from Lily's fragile wrist. Enough! I shouted, my voice raw, trembling with both anger and fear. Karen stumbled back, surprised by my sudden aggression, but the rage in my chest had clouded everything else. It was as though I was seeing red, and all I could think about was getting Karen away from my daughter, protecting her from the cruelty that was unfolding right in front of me. Get off my property! I yelled, my words laced with fury. The fear that had gripped my chest was now replaced with something more primal, something that only a parent could understand. In that moment, nothing else mattered but Lily, and I would do whatever it took to shield her from this monster standing in front of me. Karen stepped back, her face turning bright red as she struggled to regain her composure. You don't get it, do you? I'm just doing my job, she spat, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and defiance. Your daughter is breaking the rules, and if you don't control her, if you don't make her follow the community standards, there will be consequences. The irony of it all hit me like a slap in the face. She wasn't concerned about Lily's well-being. She didn't care that Lily was disabled, that she had fought so hard to have even the slightest chance at a normal life. All Karen cared about was power. Power over the people, power over our lives, power over what was supposed to be a peaceful existence. I could feel my fists clenching at my sides. I wanted to scream, to shout at her that she had no right, that she had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But in that moment, it wasn't about words anymore. It was about standing my ground, about showing Karen that we weren't going to be pushed around, that we weren't going to let her destroy our family's sense of safety and peace. I turned to Lily, who was still standing there, shaking with fear, tears running down her face. I knelt down in front of her, placing my hands on her shoulders, looking her in the eyes. It's okay, sweetie, I whispered, my voice soft but firm. You're safe now. I'm here. As Karen's angry shouts grew quieter in the background, I could hear the sobs of my daughter, her tiny hands reaching out to me. But I wasn't about to let this woman take away the love and safety we had worked so hard to build. Not today. Not ever. Karen stood a few feet away, her chest heaving with frustration, her eyes narrowing. This isn't over, she said through gritted teeth, her voice low and threatening. The HOA will take action, and there will be consequences for your insubordination. You will regret this. With that, she turned sharply and stormed off, leaving us alone in the yard, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a dark cloud. I stood there for a moment, still holding Lily in my arms, my heart racing with a mixture of relief and fury. The confrontation had been intense, but the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I knew that we had just crossed a line and that the consequences would come. But no matter what Karen or the HOA threw our way, I would fight for my family, for Lily's safety and dignity. I would not back down. The storm had only just begun. I rushed out the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I saw Karen's figure tugging at Lily's wrist. The yard, usually a peaceful space for my daughter to enjoy, had turned into a place of fear and chaos. Every step I took toward them felt like an eternity. The wind carried a chill, though the heat of the moment made it feel like I was standing in the middle of a storm. I was almost there when I saw Lily stumble, struggling to keep her footing as Karen's grip tightened. Stop, I yelled, my voice breaking through the tension. Let go of her now. Karen didn't respond. She just kept pulling Lily, a cold look in her eyes, as if my daughter was just another object to be moved around. It was then I knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to stop her. I had to act, and I had to act fast. Without thinking, I surged forward, reaching them in a matter of seconds. I grabbed Karen's arm, pulling it away from Lily. My touch wasn't gentle. There was nothing gentle about the way I held her. I could feel the surge of protective rage flooding my system, and for a split second, I didn't care about consequences. I only cared about my daughter's safety. I gave Karen a firm shove, just enough to push her back a few paces. I said, "Let go." I repeated, my voice now a deep, commanding growl that left no room for argument. Karen staggered, surprised by my sudden strength, her shocked expression shifting to one of disbelief. "What are you doing?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You can't just ignore HOA regulations. She's a violation. She's my daughter." I interjected sharply, cutting her off. My voice wasn't shaking with anger anymore. It was steady, cold, and unyielding. Every word I spoke felt like a weight landing with precision, and you will not lay a finger on her again. I turned my attention to Lily, who had been standing there, wide-eyed, too scared to move. Her small body trembled, and I could see the fear in her eyes. My heart ached for her, but I didn't let my own emotions show. I dropped down to one knee, gently placing my hands on her shoulders, looking into her eyes with as much calmness as I could muster. "You're safe now, sweetheart," I whisper, my voice soft but firm. "You're safe. I'm here, and I won't let anyone hurt you." Lily sniffled and nodded, her body slowly relaxing as she sought comfort in my presence. The weight of the fear that had gripped her seemed to slowly lift as I reassured her, my touch gentle now, my focus solely on her. But the moment wasn't over. Karen still stood there, watching us with a mixture of disbelief and anger, clearly unsettled by the way I had taken control of the situation. She opened her mouth to speak again, but I cut her off before she could even begin. "You're done here, Karen," I said, my voice calm but unmistakably final. "I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but I'm not going to let you ruin my family. Not today. Not ever." There was a long pause as Karen's gaze hardened. Her fists clenched at her sides, and I could almost feel the fury radiating off her. But there was a shift in the air, a palpable change. I could see the hesitation in her, the realization that I wasn't the man she thought I was. I wasn't just some passive resident she could walk all over, and the fear that had once gripped me was now gone, replaced with the sheer resolve that only comes from protecting what you love most. For a long moment, Karen didn't say a word. Her eyes darted between Lily and me, clearly calculating her next move. I stood there, unwavering, my body tense but still in control. Karen could try all she wanted to intimidate me, but she wasn't going to break me. And she certainly wasn't going to break my family. Finally, she let out a sharp breath and shook her head, the anger in her eyes giving way to frustration. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice barely audible as she turned to leave. "You'll regret this." I stood there, watching her walk away, her steps quick and purposeful, as though she was already plotting her next move. But I didn't let her words affect me. My focus was on Lily. The moment Karen had stepped back, I had become her shield. Nothing else mattered. "Let's go inside, baby," I said softly, standing up and offer my hand to Lily. She took it without hesitation, her small fingers gripping mine tightly. Together, we walked back toward the house, every step a reminder of how much I was willing to fight for her. I didn't look back at Karen as she disappeared down the street. The battle was far from over, but I had taken control in that moment. And as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would continue to do so. The storm had come, and it would rage on. But in that instant, I had shown Karen and myself that we were not powerless. My family would stand tall, and no matter how hard the winds blew, we would face them together. The days that followed the confrontation with Karen were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and frustration. It didn't take long for the consequences of our stand to make themselves known. The first sign that things had escalated came early the next morning when I was greeted by the harsh sound of my phone ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened as I answered it, unsure of what to expect. The voice on the other end was cold, official. "This is Officer Harris with the local police department. We've received a complaint about an altercation that took place on your property yesterday." I froze. It wasn't surprising that Karen had involved the authorities. After all, she had threatened us with escalation before leaving the yard. But hearing it so directly, hearing it from someone with authority, made the reality of our situation sink in like a stone. The police were involved, and I had no idea how deep Karen's reach really was. "I'd like to come by and speak with you about the incident," Officer Harris continued. My mind raced. I knew we hadn't done anything wrong. Karen had been the aggressor, dragging my daughter off the lawn. But how would the officer see it? How much had Karen spun the story? My eyes went to Sarah, who had just come into the kitchen. I could see the worry in her eyes as I explained what happened. "The police are coming," I said quietly, feeling the weight of the words. It felt like everything we had worked for, our peace, our safety, was being chipped away by someone with far too much power. The officer arrived an hour later, a stern, no-nonsense man who didn't seem to have much patience for pleasantries. He wanted to hear our side of the story, but it was clear from the way he held his posture that he had already been briefed by Karen. I told him everything: how Karen had dragged Lily off the lawn, how I had intervened, how she had threatened us. But even as I spoke, I could tell that the officer wasn't fully convinced. He was here to investigate an altercation, and that's all he seemed focused on, not the larger context, not the real reason why Karen had felt emboldened to go so far. When I finished, he nodded, taking notes. "I'll need to speak with Karen," he said, before turning to leave. I could feel the tension in the air long after he had gone, the unease settling deeper into the pit of my stomach. By the time the day was over, it was clear that Karen wasn't going to let this go. The phone calls began coming in, neighbors from all over the block, some of them from the HOA, others just people we had known for years, all with the same message: "We heard what happened. We just want to make sure everything's okay." Their tone was polite, even concerned, but there was an underlying current of judgment that I couldn't shake. I had seen the same faces before, waved across the street, shared small talk in passing, but now they were all too aware of what had happened, and they were all too ready to talk about it. It didn't take long for Sarah and me to realize that Karen had already started a campaign of her own, rallying the HOA members and any willing neighbors to her cause. The more we listened, the more we understood that she was working behind the scenes, painting us as the instigators in the whole affair, even though she was the one who had crossed the line. The HOA, which had always been a distant presence for us, became an immediate threat. We had always thought of them as just another group of neighbors enforcing petty rules. But now, it was clear that they had the power to destroy our sense of peace, to turn the community against us. It wasn't long before we started hearing whispers that the HOA was planning to take actions that could involve fines, penalties, or worse, an official reprimand that would affect the value of our property. Karen's influence had spread like wildfire, and now we were the ones left on the defensive. The next HOA meeting was set for that week. I knew we had to be there. Sarah and I decided to attend, even though the thought of walking into that room filled me with dread. It felt like we were about to step into the lion's den, and I wasn't sure what to expect. As we entered the meeting hall, I immediately felt the eyes of the community on us, eyes that were either filled with suspicion or outright hostility. I could see Karen sitting at the head of the table, her smug expression unmistakable. She was in her element, manipulating the room like a puppeteer with strings, rallying the HOA members to her cause. She caught my eye as we entered and gave me a look that was as cold as ice. I could feel the tension in the room spike. The meeting started with a review of new community rules, new rules that had somehow been conveniently adjusted to penalize anyone who dared to challenge Karen's authority. When it was our turn to speak, I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel every pair of eyes on us. "We're here because we were unfairly targeted," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen's actions weren't just an overstep, they were an attack on my family. And now we're being punished for standing up for what's right. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Then Karen stood up, her voice cutting through the silence. "They're trying to turn this around on me," she said, her eyes glinting with false indignation. "I was just enforcing the rules, and now, because of their defiance, they're trying to paint me as the villain." The room buzzed with whispers, but I could see the tide beginning to turn. Karen's manipulation was no longer as effective as it had been. The cracks were starting to show in her narrative. I could see some of the neighbors shifting uncomfortably, realizing that they had been manipulated into taking sides. But it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't backing down, and the HOA members weren't willing to let go of their power easily. By the end of the meeting, there was no resolution. The HOA decided to look into the matter further, but it was clear that they were going to make things harder for us. The tension was palpable. The fallout from that confrontation had spread far beyond our lawn. It had touched every part of our lives. We weren't just fighting for our yard anymore. We were fighting for our place in the community, for our right to live peacefully without fear of someone else's control. And I knew that the battle was far from over. The HOA, backed by Karen's manipulation, wasn't going to let this go easily. But neither were we. The days that followed the HOA meeting were a blur of uncertainty. The tension in the air was thick, like we were caught in a storm that had yet to fully break. While the HOA had agreed to postpone any formal action for now, it was clear they weren't ready to let us off the hook. Karen's manipulation was still echoing through the neighborhood, and whispers about us continued to circulate. It felt like our world had been upended, and no matter how many times I tried to push back against it, the pressure remained. But I wasn't willing to let it go. Not after everything we had been through. After the confrontation, I realized that I had to take control, not just for the sake of my family, but for my own peace of mind. We weren't going to be intimidated anymore. So I made a decision. It was time to take legal action. I'd heard enough stories about how homeowners were crushed by the power of the HOA, but I wasn't going to let that happen to us. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer, a specialist in property and civil disputes. The day of the meeting arrived, and Sarah and I made our way to his office. The drive there was quiet, neither of us knowing exactly what to expect. It was strange. For the first time since the conflict had begun, we both felt the weight of our actions. We knew that whatever path we took from here would change the course of our lives. The lawyer's office was sleek and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past week. He greeted us warmly, but immediately got to work, reviewing the details of our case. I explained the situation, the confrontation with Karen, the HOA's threats, the emotional toll it had taken on Sarah, and, most importantly, the effect it had on Lily. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding as he took notes, asking questions to clarify the timeline and specific events. When I finished, he looked up from his notes and met our eyes. "You've got a strong case here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What Karen and the HOA have done is not only illegal, it's abusive. They've crossed several lines, and we have grounds to file a formal complaint against them. But I'll be honest with you, it won't be easy. You'll face resistance, and it may take time. But if you're committed to seeing this through, we can make sure they understand that their actions won't be tolerated." His words hit us hard. On one hand, it felt like a weight had been lifted, the validation that we weren't crazy, that we weren't just overreacting. But on the other hand, it meant that the fight was just beginning. Karen and the HOA weren't going to back down easily, and we knew we were about to step into a much bigger battle. The emotional toll it had already taken on us, especially on Lily, was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There was still so much at stake. The lawyer outlined our options, how we could approach the situation legally, how to handle the potential retaliation from the HOA, and what steps we needed to take to protect ourselves in the coming months. He also made it clear that taking action now would send a powerful message, not just to Karen, but to the entire HOA. They needed to understand that they couldn't push people around just because they had power on paper. They needed to learn that people were willing to stand up to them. We left the meeting with a sense of purpose, but also a lingering heaviness. The lawyer had given us hope, but the road ahead would be far from easy. As we walked to the car, Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes tired but resolute. "We're doing the right thing," she said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, one that reminded me why we were fighting in the first place. It wasn't just about our home or the HOA, it was about protecting our family, standing up for our right to live without fear, and making sure that Lily grew up in a world where she wasn't defined by her disability or targeted by people like Karen. That night, we sat down together as a family. We talked about the journey ahead and the challenges that lay before us. It was hard not to be overwhelmed by everything, but there was something grounding in those moments. Lily, who had been quiet for most of the day, finally spoke up. "I'm scared," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It broke my heart to hear those words, to know that she was affected by the ugliness we had faced. But I looked at her, my heart swelling with pride, and I said, "We're all scared sometimes, sweetheart. But we're in this together. And we will fight. You don't have to be afraid. Not anymore." It wasn't an easy thing to promise. Fighting this fight would take everything we had. But in that moment, I knew we would face whatever came next with unwavering strength. We weren't just defending our home, we were defending the values that made us who we were. The next morning, we took our first official steps, filing the legal papers. The lawyer had set everything in motion. As the paperwork was filed and the wheels of justice began to turn, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen and the HOA weren't going to give up without a fight, and the consequences of our actions hadn't fully played out. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like we had a real chance at regaining control over our lives. And as we moved forward, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about winning a battle against Karen or the HOA. It was about showing our daughter and ourselves that no matter how difficult life got, we would always have the strength to stand up for what was right. Just when we thought we had a moment of peace, the storm hit again, this time in a way we never saw coming. It was a few weeks after we'd filed the legal papers, and the tension in the neighborhood had started to fade. Karen was no longer storming through the streets, and we were adjusting to life with the hope that we could finally move forward. The HOA had backed off, and the pressure had eased. Or so we thought. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I received an email that would shatter the fragile peace we had worked so hard to rebuild. It was from the lawyer, and when I opened it, my heart sank. Attached was a document from the HOA, an updated set of rules, and an ominous line buried in the fine print. Due to ongoing legal disputes and violations of HOA guidelines, a special hearing will be held to discuss the future of your property. At first, I thought it was a mistake. We had followed every rule, every guideline. We had even gone so far as to make sure the fence and everything else was compliant. But as I scrolled down the email, my eyes caught something that made the blood drain from my face. There was a name at the bottom, someone I didn't recognize. Lucas Roth. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. The email didn't explain much, but it didn't have to. It was clear. Karen wasn't fighting this alone. That night, as I sat with Sarah, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in deeper than we realized. There was something off about this. Karen's reach hadn't just stopped at a petty HOA dispute. There was more to this than her desire for control over the neighborhood. I had an uneasy suspicion that she wasn't just a rogue HOA member, but a key player in something much larger, something much darker. The next day, I did some digging. It didn't take long to find out who Lucas Roth was. His name appeared repeatedly in local news articles associated with shady real estate deals and high-profile business ventures. The more I read, the more I realized how far this went. Lucas Roth wasn't just a random HOA board member, he was a major investor with deep pockets, tied to powerful people in the city, including some local politicians. My gut twisted as the pieces started to fall into place. Karen had connections, real power, and we had been unwittingly caught in the middle of something much more dangerous than a neighborhood dispute. As I made this discovery, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous number. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly. The message was simple: "You're playing a dangerous game. Back off before it's too late." The implication was clear. Someone was watching us, and it wasn't just Karen. This wasn't about property lines or minor violations. There was something bigger at play, a conspiracy of power, control, and intimidation, and we had stumbled right into its path. The lawyer called me later that afternoon, and his voice sounded different. There was a new urgency in his tone, a sense of caution I hadn't heard before. "You need to be careful," he warned. "Karen and Roth have more influence than I thought. If you're serious about this, you need to prepare for the long haul." As I hung up, I looked at Sarah, my mind racing with 100 questions. Was this the HOA we were fighting, or something much more sinister? Who else was involved? And what did they want from us? The email was only the beginning. Karen wasn't just fighting for control of our property, she was fighting for something much bigger, and we were standing right in the middle of it. The real battle had only just begun. You thought it was over, but this was just the beginning. As the dust begins to settle, we realize this story isn't just about a family fighting back against a bully, it's about standing up for what's right. It's about showing that no matter the odds, we will always protect what matters most: our family, our home, and our dignity. But the fight isn't over. There are more challenges ahead, and we're ready to face them head on, because justice is worth the battle. If you believe in standing up for what's right, in never backing down, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and join us on this journey. We'll need your support as we continue to fight for what's fair. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to push you around? We'd love to hear your story. Thanks for watching, and remember, this is just the beginning. If you believe in fighting for what's right, standing up against injustice, and protecting your family no matter the cost, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a similar situation? We want to hear your experiences and connect with you. Don't forget to share this video with others who might need to hear this message. Together, we can make sure our voices are heard.